getting back on the grind with study advice videos, and today's is going to be about A-level history coursework. I'm going to explain how to even start going about it, how to structure it, and I'll give you guys some top tips that helped me to get an A star and also full marks. So without further ado, let's get on with the video. The first obvious thing to do is to choose a topic that you want to make your essay about. Choose something that really interests you. You're going to be spending the next few months reading up about this topic, and so you want it to be something you're passionate about and that will motivate you to continue learning about it and writing about it. Be prepared to be devoting time to your coursework for the next 3 to 6 months. Start early. For me, I spent 6 months writing my history coursework. You could definitely get yours done in a short amount of time, but I think having that 6 months did help because then I could also balance other schoolwork on top of it, because obviously I was doing 2 other A levels with it, English literature and chemistry. So as for choosing a topic, it could be something that you've touched upon in school and something that you're willing to delve deeper into, or it could be something that you've never learned about at school. And obviously that is slightly easier because there's so much that they did not teach at school. I chose Indian history. I chose to make my coursework on the partition. That interested me at the time. I decided on your question. The easiest thing that I would recommend is choosing a causational question. To what extent was X the primary cause of Y? That is how I structured my question, and that's how I'd recommend you guys to do yours, because that is the most straightforward, in my opinion, to answer, and you don't want to make your life more complicated than it needs to be. So my question was, to what extent was British misrule the primary cause of the partition? Importantly, you want to make the stated factor something that's quite obvious, something that everyone knows to be one of the causes of a certain event. But I guess the whole point of this coursework is to potentially dispute that stated factor and to see if maybe actually there's another cause of this event more significant that has not been talked about as much. You're going to need 3 factors. The first one is the primary cause, the one that's stated in your question. We'll call that source A. Source B, which should contradict source A or just be a completely different reason to it. So mine was the role of, if I butcher it, I'm sorry, but Jinnah. Your third factor, we'll call it source C. You want this to bring in an entirely new perspective. So my factor was long-term Hindu-Muslim tensions. But yeah, if you're struggling to think of factors, you could have an individual person that had a big impact. You could have the wider political context or economic context. You could split it into political factor, economic factor, social factor. So you've got 3 there. And you want to pull quotes from whatever you're using, whether it be a book or an article. I used 3 books just because there's a lot of information that you can get from that. Now that we've done some preliminary thinking about our coursework, let's dive in to the structure. Thankfully, I actually kept a copy of my coursework. Got it here. In the introduction, you want to set the scene. If somebody has no idea what partition is, how would I have described it to them? Obviously, British misrule, I had to describe what that was. It's always important to explain the key terms in your question, as you know to do in general A-level history essays. And you want to lay out your 3 factors. At the end of my introduction, I did say what my argument was going to be, what I was going to argue Jinnah's role as the primary cause. It's good to outline your argument at the very start to show the examiner that you're argumentative from the get-go, and also for them to know where the essay is heading. So in your first paragraph, you want to focus that on your stated factor. So I pulled quotes from Inglorious Empire by Shashi Tharoor. Tharoor argues that British misrule was the primary cause of the partition, according to Tharoor, and then I go on to include a quote from his book. I'm just trying to explain how British misrule led to the partition. Once you're done explaining it, you can go into the provenance, also better known as the historiography in a way. Thinking about how reliable actually is this source. Does the historian, do they have an agenda behind why they're writing this? Think about that. How does that impact the validity of their evidence? What does this mean for going forward? How much can we trust this source? There's actually a quote where Tharoor literally says, "My outrage is personal," and so we know that there's emotion behind his evidence. So clearly his agenda is blaming the British, whether that is right or not. When you're writing this coursework, even if you, let's say, side with the law, you would still need to be objective and say, okay, well, him having an agenda behind this, it would influence him to have a selection bias in his evidence. But still, you want to be balanced. Also want to lift it up and show its strengths too. It shows the examiner you're using your critical thinking, you're not taking the rules interpretation at face value. And so that's all in one paragraph. In your second paragraph, you want to go on to talk about your second factor, your source B. You want to structure the same as your paragraph about source A. So you talk about like how, in this case, Jinnah's role led to partition, explain using quotes from your book, link back to source A. It's important to keep linking back to the stated factor. So I was basically saying that the British were trying to get involved, but Jinnah was like, any declaration by the British government which in any way will militate against Pakistan would be resisted. So maybe British misrule was not as significant as we think. And then talking about how much we can trust this source, essentially. One thing you can do, like, not only their agenda, but also do they like use a variety of sources? Do they use like primary sources and secondary sources, or do they only use only secondary or like only primary? It's really good if you talk about an individual as one of your factors, because you can slip in the idea that the author is glorifying the individual, and so we should approach that interpretation with caution, which is what I said for the role of Jinnah. Okay, now the third and final factor, that's for your next paragraph. Again, same structure as the previous paragraphs. Link back to source A. There's no need to link back to source B. Just link back to source A. That's your stated factor. Another thing to look at in historiography is whether like the authors just draw from official documents, because official documents, records from the government, could potentially give a one-sided perspective, like an elitist perspective, instead of showing the whole picture. It's just something to think about if you don't know what else to comment on regarding historiography. My favourite part of this coursework was the second half. Now in your next paragraph, in your fifth paragraph, you go back to source A, you want to test it. Imagine like you've been looking at these sources in a cage, and now you're going to release them into the wild. You're going to test their validity against external sources. This really developed my historical, analytical, essay writing, argumentative skills. So we're interrogating source A right now. The law argues that British misrule was the primary cause of the partition because the British created Hindu-Muslim divisions which made the partition almost inevitable. And then my external source. I'd find a particular quote. Alex von Tunzelman supports this by arguing that the British introduced legislative assembly in India after World War I with specific seats reserved for Europeans, Sikhs, Muslims, and so on. This granted Muslims separate electorates instead of equal universal franchise. Now you need to link it back to, okay, what relevance does this even have? This bolsters the rules argument, as it shows the way in which Britain's divide and rule policy was absolutely crucial for the partition. It was only when the British exacerbated the Hindu-Muslim divide did Muslims realise that they could not have true representation in British India. You always want to say whether an external source strengthens or weakens the interpretation you're trying to test. Even if you have a piece of evidence that undermines, let's say, or strengthens one of your following causes that you haven't done a paragraph on yet, you can still mention it. So I said in my British misrule paragraph, this in a sense subtly undermines Nanda's interpretation. You just gotta keep comparing between your sources, keep the argument, keep the debate, discussion like going between them throughout the second half of your coursework now. And then at the end of that paragraph, you want to conclude what has bringing in all this external evidence made you conclude essentially about the strength of source A, the validity of it. Is the historiography that you mentioned in the earlier paragraphs, did that have an impact in the end? Him having selection bias, that showed in the end, and it impacted his interpretation, and it slightly weakened it. Even if it's like valid, it might not be the central cause as we thought it was. And then repeat that structure for the next few paragraphs. The next paragraph being about interrogating source B, and the paragraph after that about interrogating source C, remembering everything that I've mentioned. And then your conclusion is your chance to talk about all the factors. You said, okay, the stated factor was this, but I've argued that it is this instead, or maybe actually you do agree that it's the stated factor in the end. You don't need to bring in any new evidence anymore. You don't want to repeat what you said earlier in the essay. It's language, language, language. Use language to show that you're interrogating your sources. This external piece of evidence strengthens, it bolsters this source, which in turn like undermines the validity, which in turn weakens the validity of this other source. If you want to compare the sources, you can use contrastingly, similarly. Meanwhile, on the other hand, just as source A mentions this, source B fails to mention that. You know, it's like omission is so important too. Like, where are the silences? I was just editing my video. Don't mind the funky new setting. I'm just getting ready right now. But never make a point just for the sake of making a point. I've made a point and made sure to link it back to the essay question. Like, always want to make all of your sentences relevant. You don't just want to put in like, oh, I'm just gonna like put in a point evidence just to like tick some boxes. That is all that we have time for today. I'm probably also saying that because my phone is running out of storage. Leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.